The Kryzek Ascendancy had catalogued 4,311 sapient species before they found humanity, and every single one of them had learned, sooner or later, to fear the sky. It was the oldest lesson in the galaxy. Something bigger always comes. The Kryzek had come to Earth expecting to teach that lesson one more time. They left 40 years later, having learned a different one instead, and they left it written into the Ascendancy's own survival manuals under a heading that translated roughly as the honest number. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, to a diplomat named Vessk who was, by the standards of her people, an extraordinarily patient woman. She had spent 11 years cataloging per-contact civilizations, and she had a system. Every species got a number. Not a name, not a history, a number, calculated from resource output, weapons yield, population, and the slope of their technological curve. The number told her everything she needed to know about how a negotiation would go, and in 4,311 cases it had never been wrong. Humanity's number came back low, laughably low. A species barely out of its own atmosphere, squabbling over borders drawn by dead men, still burning the compressed remains of ancient swamps for power. Her superiors wanted the number filed and the planet flagged for a resource survey. Vessk filed the number, but she also did something her training told her was unnecessary. She read the footnotes. Human history was full of footnotes. Wars fought over ideas instead of resources. Diseases eradicated for no reason but that the diseases existed. A species that had on more than one occasion spent fortunes it could not afford to put its own flag on a rock 400,000 kilometers away, purely to prove that it could. The footnotes did not fit the number. Vessk noted the discrepancy, was told to disregard it, and disregarded it because that was the sort of thing you did at the start of your career and not the middle of it. The survey ship went in anyway. It was called the Austrian Comfort, which should tell you something about Kryzek humor, and it broadcast the standard first contact package on every frequency Earth was using, a set of mathematical proofs, a star map, and an offer, not a threat. The Kryzek did not open with threats. They opened with numbers because numbers in their experience ended the conversation before anyone had to raise their voice. Humanity's response took 6 days to arrive, which the Kryzek found insultingly slow, and then extraordinarily fast once they understood what 6 days of human argument actually contained. It was not a single message. It was 1,100 of them in every language Earth had a keyboard for, arriving in a chaotic, overlapping storm that no protocol had prepared anyone for. Some were governments, some were universities. A significant number were private citizens who had simply pointed a radio telescope at the sky and started talking because nobody had told them they couldn't. Vessk, reviewing the intercepts, found this behavior statistically impossible for a species with humanity's number. Disorganized aggression toward an unknown superior force was supposed to have a ceiling. Humanity's ceiling did not appear to exist. The Ascendancy sent a second ship, then a third. Each one carried orders that grew steadily less confident and steadily more heavily armed, which is its own kind of tell if you know how to read it. By the time the fourth fleet arrived, humanity had done 3 things nobody's model accounted for. They had built a joint orbital defense authority out of 30 rival nations in under a year. They had reverse-engineered enough of the Austrian Comfort's drive signature from 6 days of passive scanning to begin drafting their own. And they had sent back a message that was not a proof, not a threat, and not a plea. It was a single sentence, translated with what the Kryzek later admitted was suspiciously perfect idiom. We intend to disagree with your number. Vessk was recalled to oversee what her superiors still at that point called a correction. She arrived in orbit with the Fourth Fleet and watched, from a data seat she'd occupied for 11 years without ever needing to raise her voice, as the correction did not go as planned. Human ships met them? Small ships. Ugly ships by Kryzek aesthetics, built in a hurry from 3 different national traditions bolted together with what her engineers politely called improvisational welding. They should not have been fast enough to matter. They were fast enough to matter. They should not have had weapons capable of touching Kryzek shielding. They had weapons capable of touching Kryzek shielding, because it turned out that 6 days of chaotic overlapping argument had also contained several hundred physicists who had independently arrived at the same solution to a problem the Kryzek had assumed was decades beyond them. The battle, when the histories finally settled on a name for it, was called the 6-Day War by people who liked irony and the filing error by people who worked with Vessk and never let her forget it. It was not a rout. Humanity lost ships. Humanity lost people, more of them than any single human government wanted to admit at the time. And Vessk, watching the tactical feed, understood something her number had never once needed to account for in 4,310 other first contacts. This species was not fighting to win. It was fighting to make winning expensive. Every human pilot who died bought exactly one thing: time, and the demonstrated fact that the price would not go down. The Fourth Fleet withdrew to the edge of the system to reassess, which every Kryzek captain understood was the polite word for retreat, and it was during that withdrawal that Vessk did the thing that ended her career and started her legend, depending on which historian you asked. She requested a personal channel to the human negotiating authority, not a fleet channel, not a diplomatic one. Personal one because she had a question that was not in any protocol, and protocols she had decided somewhere over those 6 days were themselves part of the problem. The human who answered was not a president or a general. He was a translator named Adebio Fasten, seconded from the orbital authority because he happened to be awake and available, and he would later say that he had absolutely no idea in that moment that he was representing his entire species. Vessk asked him one thing. She asked him why, not why fight. The tactics answered that. Why keep going? Why did a species with no realistic chance of victory against 4 fleets keep sending ships that could not win, piloted by people who knew they could not win, against an enemy with numbers that made the outcome in any rational accounting already decided? Fasten's answer took him 11 seconds, which the Kryzek transcript logged precisely, because 11 seconds was considered a remarkably short deliberation time for a species about to explain its own extinction. He said, because the number was never the point. The number tells you how a fight is supposed to end. It doesn't tell you what it costs to make us stop believing that. Vessk sat with that translation for 4 hours before she forwarded it to the Ascendancy's High Council, unedited, with a formal recommendation attached that the correction be suspended pending review. She was not authorized to make that recommendation. She made it anyway because somewhere in those 6 days she had stopped being a diplomat calculating an outcome and started being a witness to something her entire career had not equipped her to name. The council, to its very limited credit, did not court-martial her for it. They read the transcript. They read the casualty figures, human and Kryzek both, and they read, for the first time in 4,311 contacts, an engagement report that ended not with a number but with a warning. This species does not stop when the math says they should. Plan accordingly or do not plan at all. The war did not end that day. It ground on, badly, expensively, for another 11 months, because 4 fleets do not turn around on the strength of one translator's 11-second answer. And because there were people on both sides who still believed the number would eventually reassert itself given enough time and enough dead. It did not reassert itself. Every human loss bought a small, permanent, compounding piece of respect that the Kryzek command structure had no category for and slowly, grudgingly, had to build one. Humanity kept losing battles and kept refusing to lose the war, and somewhere in month 9, a Kryzek fleet commander named Oresh Vantal Kadu did something that had never happened in the Ascendancy's recorded history. He surrendered a battle he was winning, because his ships had taken losses his superiors back home would call acceptable, and he personally, standing on his own bridge watching human pilots fly directly into a formation they could not survive rather than yield an inch of a system that held nothing of strategic value whatsoever, found that he no longer wanted to know how many more of them it would take. The treaty that eventually ended it was not a surrender and was not a victory. It was, and remains, the only treaty in Kryzek diplomatic history negotiated on equal footing with a species whose number on paper said equal footing should have been impossible. Vessk led that negotiation herself, reinstated with a rank nobody quite knew how to translate, because she was the only person in the Ascendancy who had understood from the very first 6 days that the number had never been lying about human capability. It had been lying about human limits, and those were not the same measurement at all. 40 years later, humanity sat on the Ascendancy's outer council as neither client nor conqueror, which had also never happened before, and the Kryzek Ascendancy's survival manuals, the ones given to every new diplomat cataloging a new species, carried a footnote that Vessk herself had insisted on writing. It said that resource output, weapons yield, and technological slope will tell you how a war is supposed to go. They will not tell you what a species is willing to pay to make the war go differently. That number does not show up in any scan. It only shows up in the fighting, and by the time you have it, you have already paid to learn it. Adebio Fasten, long retired from translation work, was asked once, at a joint human-Kryzek symposium marking the treaty's 30th anniversary, whether he regretted his 11-second answer given everything it had cost to prove it true. He said no. He said the honest number, the one Vessk had eventually written into her people's own doctrine, was never really about the Kryzek at all. It was about every human who had ever looked at odds that said stop and decided instead to find out exactly how expensive it would be to make them wrong. Vessk, in the audience that day, was asked the same question by a young Kryzek officer training in First Contact Protocol, fresh out of the academy, and still carrying a number of her own for every unmet species in her files. Vessk told her something that never made it into any official record, because it wasn't a policy, it was just true. She said that in 4,311 contacts, humanity was the only species that had ever made her feel, for the first time in an 11-year career built entirely on certainty, genuinely unsure how war would end. And she said that uncertainty, more than any weapon humanity ever built, was the thing that finally taught the Ascendancy to look at the sky the same way every other species already had to look at Earth, carefully, and without assuming the number was the whole story. The young officer asked what she should do the day she finally met a species with a low number of her own to file. Vessk thought about 6 days of chaotic radio noise, about ugly ships built from 3 traditions and improvisational welding, about 11 seconds of honest translation that had cost both their peoples a war to prove correct, and she said, "File the number." Then read every footnote. And if the footnotes don't fit, do not disregard the discrepancy, because I did once, and it took a war and 40 years and a species that refused every single opportunity to be exactly as small as we expected, to teach me that the footnotes were the truth and the number was only ever the guess. End.